Do you think that will work?
I'm in your able hands.
So the first question, which I mentioned before the break, and it's one of the things that I think is very skillful in what you spelled out in the teachings here, and that is that people have fears of compassion of different kinds. I'll get overwhelmed, or if I'm compassionate, or various other kinds of fears. I'm unworthy, and so forth. So would you talk about that, the kind of resistance that you've seen, certainly among Western people, and more than that, how we work with it, because people want to know, how do I do this?
Yes. I think the interesting thing about compassion is that increasingly, even the science is showing that it is actually a very natural part of who we are. Compassion, the mindfulness is something that you have to cultivate. But compassion is actually, it's already there in all of us. So then the question is also, the science is increasingly pointing out that compassion is actually very good for you. There's all sorts of health benefits coming out of compassion, greater sense of purpose, buffer against loneliness, and even there is such a thing as helper's high when you act out of kindness to someone. If compassion is so natural, and if compassion is so good, then the question is, why don't we do it often? And this is where I think this whole understanding that we ourselves bring resistance and fear into the picture, I think makes perfect sense. And I think in contemporary culture particularly, we have quite a conflicted relationship with compassion. On the one hand, at the individual personal level, most of us value compassion. Most of us are drawn towards someone who's compassionate, someone who's kind. So we do value compassion, but at the same time, the larger narrative of society, which is scientific picture of who we are as a species, makes us feel very suspicious of compassion and kindness. We are constantly told that our fundamental nature is, selfish. The fundamental driver behind human behavior is the pursuit of self-interest, which manifests in competition. So, we are constantly reminded that this is actually our true nature, and compassion may be a good thing. It's something that the religion and other things brings from outside to kind of keep a lid on this rather beastly nature that is really us. So people become suspicious. There is a notorious statement made by quite a well-known American biologist who said, "Scratch an altruist and watch a hypocrite bleed." That's actually coming from a very, very, well-respected scientist. They were, they really mean it, and so I think we also, in addition to personal resistances we also bring cultural resistances. And I know, for example, quite some, often, my wife is French Canadian, so I'm married into a non-Tibetan family. Actually, some of my Tibetan friends and relatives tease me because in the Tibetan tradition you have brides and grooms, and sometimes when a family has only daughters, then they bring the groom from outside, and so the man marries into that family. So they tease me that I've married into a French Canadian family. So I sort of live, as Jack pointed out, that not only do I work professionally in translation between cultures, but even in my own personal life, I kind of live at this interface of two cultures. So I have noticed among my wife's relatives, friends, aunts, and some of them are now old, and I've seen her grandmother's family and others. And one thing that I was surprised was actually to see among the elderly a kind of almost like a feeling of frustration that they are not useful. They feel useless. And this is a strange thing, because in Tibetan society you never see this, because old people, age gracefully, and then they expect to be served. I mean, this is how they expect to be served, because they did their bit. They brought up the family, they worked hard, and when you're old, your role is to say the Om Mani Padme Hum and do rituals and chanting and go around the temples, but you expect to be served. You don't feel useless family member. And so I think here, these are things that we bring culturally. And of course, some of us will know it's culturally acquired, but most of us don't give it a second thought. We just, act out of it. So I think here, this is where mindfulness practice is really helpful. Mindfulness makes us more aware of, what is going on. And mindfulness practice also makes us become more aware of where certain things like resistance is coming from. Where is that resistance coming from, like fear? And then we will be able to, and then in addition to this, if we are able to bring self-compassion, then combination of mindfulness and self-compassion will then allow us to be more at home with that compassionate part of ourselves. Because in the end, as social creatures, we instinctively crave for connection. This is who we are. And, there is nothing wrong with needing someone. But in the West, because the culture of autonomy and independence is so prized, people hate to be dependent. People hate needing someone. But as human beings, as social creatures, our happiness and suffering is defined by the quality of our relationship with others. So I think as we are able to bring more mindfulness and self-compassion into the equation, then I think we will become more at ease with where we are. I mean, I think in the end, a truly spiritual person, someone who is gifted in the realization, is someone who is totally at ease in his or her own skin. And this is what you see with someone like His Holiness. He is totally at ease. There's a sense of almost like a childlike freedom. There's a sense of abandon. There's no real heaviness, or that he brings. There's a kind of a lightheartedness, and I think that can be cultivated. So when you're young, you act like young. When you're old and elderly, you're wise and elderly, and then you expect someone to help and serve you when you cannot do things physically. So I think this is where I think this being more aware of why we bring resistance, I think is really helpful.
Thank you. You also spell out in this how this is the part on self-compassion, that there's a kind of unworthiness. Do I deserve to be compassionate, or will I get overwhelmed if I'm compassionate? Then everything else will come in and I won't be able to handle it. It will be too much, which is that mistake of empathy versus compassion. And I've told this story before, but I think it's fitting tonight. Good friend Wes Nisker, who's a teacher here, who's just starting a retreat tonight, went to interview Gary Snyder, who's now 84, 85, and one of the great environmentalists of our time, Pulitzer Prize winner, author of Earth Household 40 years ago, 50 years ago, and so forth, and great poet, and said, Gary, if you look at climate change now, the loss of species, the desertification, the rising oceans, the pollution, and so forth, from all these years of your work, what do you have to say to us? And Gary said, don't feel guilty. He said, if you look at this and feel guilty, you'll just contribute to the suffering that caused this, because whether it's the activist or anybody else, if you're trying to change it out of guilt or shame or anger, so forth, that keeps it spinning. He said, if you're gonna change it or you're gonna save it because you love it. Save it because it's you, it's part of you in some way. And so there's something about shifting from the idea that I have this responsibility and I have to do things in emergency, or that I'll get overwhelmed. I can't dare look at climate change or Nepal or whatever it is, to say, I love this. I'm only one person, I can do what I can. But you do it out of love and attending rather than out of some other idealistic way that actually puts you into the cycle of creating suffering. And so there's some invitation in this compassion. We seem to be afraid, oh, I'll get overwhelmed, or I don't deserve it, or others don't, to realize that if we base our practice on love, and the idea isn't to perfect yourself, it's to perfect your love. Then when you see that, then your whole spiritual practice changes, and it's not about some experience that you have, but about the capacity you have to be present for this mysterious human life with a loving heart. So I have one more question then, and maybe you'll teach us a practice, and that is being in Dharamsala, which is where His Holiness the Dalai Lama has his seat, and many Tibetans in exile and so forth. One of the places that's there that I visited is the Tibetan Children's Village, which has taken either orphans or children who were sent over the mountains whose parents couldn't care for them to raise them. And you think orphanage, and generally you start to think about like Dickens or something. Some really, seriously, and you read that old stuff. And it's terrifying, oh my gosh. But the Tibetan Children's Village, when you go in, these are the bright-eyed, rosy-cheeked, most joyful, beaming children. You just get knocked over by their joy, even though they're, in quote, orphans, because they're loved in some amazing way. And then you go and you spend time around His Holiness, and I don't know if you were recently there in Dharamsala, but I know that Archbishop Tutu was also there. And the Dalai Lama and Tutu are working on a book on joy. All right, and then Tutu has this great giggle, and the Dalai Lama, everybody goes to hear him laugh, And it's like, how could he, with all the suffering he sees, the tragedies in Tibet and the other things, how could somebody who sees that with such an open heart still have joy and laughter? So here's my question: how does he do that? How we were close to him for all these years, and what do we have to learn from that for ourselves?
Actually, I was with His Holiness for the particular dialogue with Bishop Desmond Tutu. I was privileged to be with them in the same room for 5 days, 5 mornings. And those who know Archbishop Desmond Tutu, he really is one of the few people who is capable of bringing the mischievous side of His Holiness, the kind of the childlike side of him. It was a real joy. I think, sometimes in the West, Western Buddhists tend to be actually a little bit too serious.
A little.
And if you look at the Asian traditional Buddhists on the whole, there's less seriousness. It could be a bad thing, or it could be a good thing. And also, for example, until recently, in almost all the traditional Asian Buddhist societies, lay people did not meditate. And even many monks did not meditate. It was chanting and the rituals and the prayers were the main thing. There were some meditators. Where in the West, and it's a wonderful thing that the Western Buddhists emphasize meditation, because it emphasizes self-development and practice and working with your mind and all of this, which is fantastic. Which is what the Buddha actually wanted us to do. But the downside of that is then we tend to take things very seriously in the West, and we forget that part of the teaching that the Buddha also gave was to appreciate the joyful aspect of life. And one of the 6 perfections is virya, which is in the Tibetan tradition we translate it as the joyous effort. And it's not just a simple exertion or effort, but it's actually translated as joyful effort. And the idea is that in your Dhamma practice, you need to find a way to actually enjoy it. Because if you're not able to bring in the element of joy, then there will be less self-sustaining motivation mechanism. The moment you're able to bring joy into the equation, then there will be a self-sustaining motivation system. And those of us who have raised small kids, we know trying to teach a child a musical instrument or a sports. At the beginning there is no substitute rather than forcing them. You have to drag them. In Quebec it's -20 sometimes Celsius, and in Quebec if we don't ski, the winter gets very, very long. So every parent wants to make sure that their children at least learn the basic skills of skiing. When they grow up, if they can afford, they will ski. If they can't afford, they won't ski. But at least they will know how to do it. So initially, you have no choice but to drag them screaming in this cold climate. But there is a tipping point. There will come a point when they will really enjoy skiing. After that, it's effortless. You say, okay, skiing time. They pack themselves, and then when they're able to inspire their friends to come along. And so I think this joy, this is where someone like His Holiness has this quality, because his practice is not a drudgery. He's not grinding his teeth and say, oh yeah, I've got to sit down again and and put in the hours. He's not doing this. He's enjoying it. He gets up at 3:30 in the morning. He does his morning practice. By the time we are getting up and having to have breakfast, he's already done a couple of hours of practice, and he does it regularly, and he enjoys it. And I think this is an important lesson that we need to. Sometimes we Dhamma practitioners tend to take it a little bit too seriously. We almost take it upon ourselves as a duty, and maybe there's also an element of Western cultural heritage where we're so used to being guilty, and we have this image of ourselves as a good Dharma student, and if we fail to meditate one day, then we feel guilty and we start beating ourselves. So I think if we remember someone like His Holiness's face, he is truly a happy man. Of course, the problems of Tibet and the world does weigh heavily on him. But he at the same time, he doesn't forget that life is also about joy.
There's a way we can become too loyal to our suffering. I think somehow that's a good Dharma thing, and it's not. And there's a story you may know when Zen Master Thich Nhat Hanh first came to teach Zen. He came earlier and met with Martin Luther King and was nominated for the Nobel Prize because of his peace work during the Vietnam War. But when he came as a Zen teacher, and he came to, at least as I was told, the San Francisco Zen Center, which is one of the main Zen centers in America, and he taught his practices and so forth. At the end, he said, you don't smile. He said, if you don't smile and start to take some joy, I'm not coming back. He threatened them, and you want me to come back? And they loved him. He said, you got to start sitting and put a little smile on your face, and this can't just be a grim duty, for just the very reasons that you're talking about. So there's something that you're saying, and now we're about to lead to do the Tonglen practice, that the Dalai Lama, His Holiness, represents. And I've seen it as you have so thousands of times. He can meet somebody when they're suffering with great compassion, and tears will roll down his cheeks. And then, that passes through like some wave or something. And 5 minutes later, he'll be playing with a child or hear some story, and he'll be giggling. And it's like it doesn't stick in him. So his heart is open in a way that allows the 10,000 joys and the 10,000 sorrows to move through him as if they're supposed to, rather than there's something wrong with either one of them in some way. And I think, in teaching Tonglen, as you will, or compassion practice, there's someone which we have to trust that that your heart is actually big enough, that you contain the great heart of compassion, that you were born with it, and that you contain the spaciousness of wisdom. And meditation is an invitation to remember this, to embody it in a way so that you can trust it. So,
thank you. So we'll do a very short Tonglen meditation, and reposition yourself.
They may not know what Tonglen is. So
okay, I'll guide you through. It's a Tibetan compassion meditation. So at the beginning, let's take 3 deep breaths. So take it in, hold it for a little while, and then let it out. Okay, one more time. Hold it, then let it out. Okay, one more time. Hold it, then let it out. Okay, now find the natural rhythm of your breathing. Not too hard, not too slow. A rhythm that is not effortful, so that you don't have to pay attention to the breath. Just adopt a very normal breathing rhythm. And really try to slow down, just as much as possible. Almost as if you're listening to an inner silence. Just try to listen to an inner silence. Just slowing everything down. If some thoughts come up, just observe it, let it go, and try to return to this inner silence. Now think of an image that you have recently seen from the scene of devastation in Nepal after the earthquake. Possibly a child standing in front of the ruined remains of his or her home, looking terrified, confused, afraid. Or the parents of that child, looking really confused. Think of this person's pain. Pain of the loss of a loved one. And the fear, the uncertainty, not knowing what will happen to them. And terrified of what might happen when the monsoon rain comes. Think of their distress, fear, anxiety, and deep sense of uncertainty. Now as you breathe in more deeply, imagine taking all of this in the form of clouds or smokes from them, which enters into your body and all dissolves and disappears into an orb of light at your heart. Imagine as you breathe in, you take them away from them, into yourself, into this light at your heart. as you breathe out more deeply, imagine sending to them your courage, assurance, encouragement, and your compassion, and your sense of concern, and your strength, and your love, in the form of light rays coming out of you and touching their body. Let's do this as we breathe out more deeply. We offer them courage, strength, assurance, and our love. Now let's expand the scope of our meditation and include the people of entire Nepal, all the areas affected by the earthquake. As we breathe in, take their pain, fear, uncertainty, and as we breathe out, send them our love, courage, encouragement, and assurance. Now let's bring our attention back into this hall and try to do this practice to everybody in this hall. Each one of us in this hall, as human beings, we have our own problems, our own worries, our own concerns, anxieties, sadness. Each one of us is exactly the same at this fundamental level of humanity. Imagine taking from around you, from everybody in this hall, their pain, their worries, their anxieties, their problems. And as we breathe out, imagine giving to each one of the person in this hall your courage, your encouragement, your assurance, and your compassion, and your love. Breathe in, suffering, problems, and breathe out, your courage, your assurance, and your compassion. We will end this meditation with 4 immeasurable prayers. May all beings find happiness and its causes. May all beings be free from suffering and its causes. May all beings find happiness that is free from misery. May all beings abide in equanimity, free from the biases of attachment and aversion. Thank you. Then just look around your neighbors, okay? Just look at each other's face. Thank you.
Jinpa, can I ask you a question, and then we'll take some others? In doing this form of compassion practice, in which you breathe in the suffering of others and then let it be transformed in the light of the heart into compassion and love, people will often say, I'm afraid if I take that in, it will overwhelm me or will make me sick or so forth. How do you respond to that question?
I think, that's why this imagery of having a light at your heart, where the pains that you take dissolves, I think it's an important imagery. Because just like, when there is a very bright sunshine, the mists get dissolve and disappear. They don't have to go anywhere, they just dissolve. So that's a beautiful imagery. So, from the Buddhist point of view, of course, this is the Buddha nature. This is the image for Buddha nature. But in a secular context, we don't use that terminology. But the light in many cultures has association with purity, and therefore that has a power. And I think that imagery will help.
So, would you like to take some questions?
Sure.
We've got a handheld mic.
First of all, thank you. This has been really awesome. But I have a question about, there have been some I've been studying about at the beginning of time how man was using 100% of his brain and people were able to communicate through energy. And I feel sort of a reemergence of that through all kinds of spiritual practice and indigenous. I've seen that through most recently. So my question to you is how would you, what's your view about that in terms of activities like this? When we're actually putting out this kind of energy, is that helping our capacity to be using more than 10% of our brain to make those connections around the world, or what?
Thank you for the question. I think, definitely there are, I know that in kind of very strict scientific idea, for something to impact another event, there needs to be some medium through which the influence can be tracked. so there needs to be a kind of a physical connection. But I do think that when collectively, more and more people engage in this kind of practice and rise more to the, kind of the better part of their, their side, which is the compassionate, kinder side, I think it impacts the larger society. What exactly is the mechanism by which this impact is taking place? I don't know. So now as to the question of, whether we are increasingly going to be able to use, most part of our brain, I'm not so sure. Because and a lot of the things that are happening for us happens at the level below consciousness. Now, through meditation practice, as individuals become more advanced, some of those processes which are subconscious may come to the surface of consciousness, but many of these processes, just because of the speed with which they are taking place, I don't think we'll be able to come to the consciousness of the individual. So, for example, even in a simple act of interaction, say between you and a friend in a restaurant, talking, without thinking about it, we change the tone of our voice, we adjust our posture. The scientists who are doing research on human behavior know these things are happening, but the individuals themselves do it subconsciously. We dance, we adjust. We are such deeply social creatures that we intuitively, pick up the signals without necessarily thinking about it, and adapt our behavior in that particular situation. And many of these are happening so fast that, in order to make it to the consciousness of the person, there needs to be a kind of at least a time, longer period of time. So I don't think that we will get to a point where, this idea of using the 100% of the brain, if we mean it by making it more conscious to the person, I don't think biologically we are designed to be able to do that. I don't know if that's the question you're asking. Thank you.
Just going to add something, thinking about the social, the question of how we use our brains and our minds and so forth, which I've talked about before. There's some way in which it's very clear that no amount of technological development, computers and biotechnology and nanotechnology and space technology and all these amazing things alone are going to stop continuing warfare,
Yes.
are going to stop continuing racism, are going to stop continuing climate disruption or tribalism, or all the things that are plaguing us in the world. And that these fantastic outer developments, which, I have, the great Library of Alexandria in my pocket, basically, along with all the trivia of the world, all together, that these amazing technological things are now needing to be wedded with an inner development of the human capacities for interconnection, for compassion, for presence. These are all part of our birthright, our capacities. But now humankind is being called to match those outer developments with the inner technology, if you will. And then we'll be able to use them in a wise way. And I'm heartened by that. Even with all the problems of the world, I also see the spread of spiritual teachings and Dharma as ways that there are many, many parts of the world that are waking up to this reality that consumerism, we were talking about China, wealth alone doesn't make you happy, and that there has to be some deeper spiritual understanding. So I see that being fruitful for what we do, but also for the development of humankind.
I'm interested in I clearly heard what both of you said with the technological, and they are wondrous, cell phone back in your pocket and so forth. But I'm wondering how this, in some way, promotes faster electronic communication, but actual personal communication, it's encouraging what seems like a disconnection.
Yes, yes.
And how would you respond to that?
Yeah, that I think is a very, very serious question, and I think that probably is going to be one of the most important questions for the generation of our children, because we grew up, and at least I remember the good old days when there were hardly any telephones or the typewriter were just, I remember that because I'm old enough. But my children, they just don't have any memory of that, and especially my younger one is 16. The elder one is 18, so she somehow she escaped that trap. But the younger one is 16, and she has grown up with a whole generation of smartphone and Facebook and Instagram and all of that stuff. And I think, if you look at something like Facebook, most people have over 200 friends because the algorithm is designed in such a way that it sends messages out to everybody on your contact list without your understanding that actually it's not you who is sending request for friend acceptance. And then all these 200 odd people put up their postings. So I don't think we are designed to be constantly connected with 200 people on a daily basis. I don't think human brains have the capacity to do that. And if at all, it's going to be very, very superficial, and it's very time consuming. And in any case, people are going to put up what they think is the best part of them in the Facebook, and they're not going to put up about the problem and the struggles they're having. So in any case, the information you get about someone's life from Facebook is a very, very superficial, artificial one. So in this kind of situation, what is going to happen to a human-to-human relationship and all the things that come out of it? And at this point, I don't think we know. And this is scary. I think the only thing that we can do as a society is take the responsibility back on the shoulders of the parents, and to really teach your children a kind of a proactive discipline of engaging with the devices. For example, in our home, we don't allow any digital devices on the dining table, and we insist on having dinner every day together, unless there is some special school program or something. And once you create those boundaries, and of course, as parents, you yourself have to respect this, because you cannot bring your cellular phone pretending that you have something more important than your children to do, and then ask them that they can't bring. So I think these are things that parents, we will have to bring, because the larger technology world is not going to think about this. They only think about money. They only think about opportunities. They only think about new products, which becomes new needs. And if more than 30-40% of your peers, like children, teenagers, if more than 20-30% have it, it's very difficult for parents to say you don't need it. So the technology world and the commercial world is not going to care how that is going to impact social life or culture and society as a whole. It's each of us as parents, we have the responsibility to really set the boundaries. And the long-term societal consequences and cultural consequences of these technologies, we don't know. It's very difficult. I'm having a conversation at Facebook actually, so as part of my book, and I hope there will be one question like this. Thank you.
During the practice we just did, I was really struck by your use of the word assurance and sending or sharing our assurance. And I'm much more used to the word reassurance, and I was thinking about that a lot. And I think in the West we talk a lot, there's a lot of an issue with self-hatred, and we also talk a lot about people who have self-assurance. And we talk about reassuring people, which I feel like is almost can be a false kind of sense of saying, oh, everything's going to be okay, or glossing over problems.
Yes.
And I was wondering if you could talk about this concept of assurance and sharing assurance, and how it might relate to or be different from those things.
I think, I wasn't particularly consciously thinking about the distinction between reassurance versus assurance. But often in the case of a difficult situation, when someone in front of you, a loved one, is going through a very difficult time, what is needed is a kind of an assurance. It's not so much reassurance. It's more of an assurance, making them feel, give them courage, give them some kind of strength. And, so I tend to use the word assurance rather than reassurance. And sort of assurance comes more naturally. But I wasn't really thinking about the distinction between the two, honestly. Thank you.
One more.
Yeah, yeah. There's one here.
Sorry, where? I was in Nepal recently, and my understanding is that the carbon output of one American equals about 250 of the Nepalese in the Sherpa area that I was in. And I do feel guilty about that, and I feel like it, in some ways, prevented some degree of compassion, or not exactly compassion, but just human connection.
Sure.
Between myself and the people I met, because I felt guilt for my presence there and for the way that I lived my life. And I don't exactly have a question, I just wondered what you thought about that.
Yeah, thank you. I think it is, guilt generally is not a very helpful emotion. Because the problem with guilt is that although guilt may sometimes work as a kind of motivating factor, but generally guilt always leaves a sort of an aftertaste of some kind of discomfort, and you associate that particular experience or situation with that kind of feeling something isn't quite right. You just feel uncomfortable, and because of this, you instinctively try to avert your gaze, not think about it. So initially, guilt is the powerful motivating factor, but in the long run, guilt is not really constructive. But I think one can recognize this disparity and unfairness between the kind of excessive lifestyle we lead in North America and the simplicity of the lifestyle people are living in some parts of the world, and how there is a disparity between us in the consumption of natural resources and the carbon imprint that we are producing. That recognition of that disparity is helpful. But at the same time, where you can make a difference is to then start thinking, how can we adjust my life? So that I as an individual, and some of that may be, offering some help in that particular area. Because each of us, no one can really help everywhere in the world. Even Bill Gates with his billions is not going to be able to help everyone in the world, okay? So then, for most of us ordinary folk, who are struggling on a day-to-day basis, making a living, as any other person, ideally we would want to share part of our resources to the more deserving and poorer part of the world. And now the question is, how do we do this? So generally, we will do it in an area where we feel an emotional connection. And because we cannot do it all over the world, and you make that connection either through a friend who has a personal connection, who talks to you about the situation, you feel moved, then you work. Or you went on a trip, you saw the situation, you were very inspired by that particular experience and the need of that situation, then you feel moved, and then you help. And I think that's a much more healthy response than really feeling guilty. Because guilt generally ends up, because you don't want to revisit it. That's the problem.
So we've come to the end of the time for the evening. First, again, I want to thank you, Jinpa, so much for coming and offering these teachings. And it's really a carrying of the lamp of the Dharma of awakening. That you talk about light in the heart. There's some way in which we are born with a spirit that has, call it Buddha nature, whatever you want to call it, true nature. This capacity, each of you, a capacity for compassion. Each of us has a capacity for awakening. Each of us has a capacity for a freedom even in the circumstances that are difficult given to us. And that capacity to live with wisdom and love and compassion is really the invitation and the assurance that you transmit in some way from all the beautiful teachings of Tibet and your years of practice, that this is your birthright, that this is possible for you. So I'd like us to end with a very simple chant, and then after we do that, we'll go out into the evening. Jinpa will be here to sign some more books for those, but if there's somebody who's parked behind you, no, if you're parked behind someone else, excuse me, that's right, then you should get in the front of the line so that you're not keeping somebody from leaving who has a babysitter or something like that. And then as you just spoke of in this last question, which is really very moving, both ways, there will be baskets at the door as you leave. And if you can give $10 or $100 or $1,000, for people who are now living under tarps as the rainy season starts. It's one of the things you can do among many for the people in Nepal, and it would be very gratefully received. So the chant is this. When you meet someone in India, the most common greeting is to put your hands together and say Namaste, which means I honor the divine within you, that spark, Buddha nature, true nature, whatever you want to by name use. And the root of that word namaste in Sanskrit, Pali, is the word namo, which means to honor or bow to or pay respect to. So I'd like us to chant namo 9 times. And as we do, you can think of what you want to make a bow to, and it may be in gratitude for certain things that have been given to you. It may be when you think of Nepal, for all the people who are helping one another after this disaster, how the mothers are helping the children, how the people in the villages are tending one another. You want to bow to that human spirit. It may be something else that you feel that you want to bow to as a recognition. And then after 9 times we will end, and you can carry the lamp of the teachings, whatever has been of value to you, back into your families and your community in the world. No. And may you carry the blessings of a fearless heart, of compassion, of well-being for yourself and for all that you've done. Thank you. Thank you for coming. It's really sweet to be back on Monday night. Thank you, Jinpa. And I'll see you again Maybe in this new building.